Good afternoon and good morning to those who have joined from North America, and good afternoon to those who have joined from Europe, and for us it's almost good evening. So on behalf of the Task Force on Climate Development and the International Financial Architecture and the Center for Policy Dialogue, I would like to welcome you to this high-level dialogue on achieving debt sustainability in the face of climate change and report launch titled Navigating Debt, Development and Disasters, Making Debt Sustainability Analysis Work for Bangladesh. I'm happy to see my colleagues from Boston University and also the task force members. Thank you very much. It is early morning there, but we are really grateful for for you that you have joined us. Just for those who do not know about the task force, I'll give a brief introduction. But Dr. Kevin Gallagher, who is a professor at Boston University, he is well suited for that. He will speak more about that. But CPD has been a member of this task force on climate development and the international financial architecture of Boston University. In fact, task force is a consortium of experts from around the world, which utilizes rigorous empirical research to advance a development-centered approach to climate change across international financial architecture. And as part of this task force, CPD researchers have undertaken a study on navigating debt, development and disasters, making debt sustainability analysis work for Bangladesh, which has been published recently. And this report evaluates the impact of climate change on Bangladesh's debt sustainability by integrating climate-related risks and the resource requirements associated with the climate transition into the debt sustainability analysis. It also discusses practical policy options to address the challenges. In this session, major findings of this research will be presented by my colleague. The presentation will be followed by a high-level discussion on how to achieve debt sustainability in the face of climate change. So I would like to also mention in this context that, as you know, that at the 2025 International Monetary Fund and World Bank Group annual meetings, which have just concluded in Washington, D.C., the fiscal constraints faced by least developed countries in meeting their external debt obligations were a key topic of conversation, alongside the growing impacts of climate vulnerability, which together pose significant risk to LDC's economic resilience. And Bangladesh, which is a country which is set to transition from its least development category next year, November, sits at the nexus of debt sustainability concerns and climate vulnerability. Economic loss and damage due to climate change put Bangladesh at risk of failing to service its external debt obligations in the event of a large climate change-induced natural disaster. In addition, Bangladesh's poor domestic resource mobilization record implies its primary budget deficit is rising, making it increasingly challenging to service future external debt repayments without taking on new external debt. So to discuss the impact of climate change on debt sustainability of climate vulnerable countries like Bangladesh and what should be done to address these challenges, we have a set of highly distinguished panelists today. This event will feature, as I have mentioned in the beginning, that virtual set of virtual address by a set of distinguished guests who are located around the world, particularly in the USA. But we also have here at the center where we are organizing this program, CPD's Climate Week, we have also a set of distinguished speakers. Our chairman of the Center for Policy Dialogue, Professor Rehman Sobhan, is here, and we also have a number of guests. Let me introduce them to you first. We have here Dr. Sadiq Ahmed, who is the Vice Chairman, Policy Research Institute in Dhaka, but he's a former high official of the World Bank. He served for a long period of time at the World Bank. And we have Mr. Enamul Haq, who is the Managing Director and Country Risk Officer of Standard Chartered Bank in Bangladesh. We have two distinguished journalists, Mr. Sajjadul Rahman, Deputy Editor, The Business Standard, Mr. Asjadul Kibriya, Planning Editor, The Financial Express. We have Syed Yusuf Sadat, who was previously a researcher of CPD, but now has moved to UNDP. And online, we have Dr. Kevin P. Gallagher, Professor, Boston University, Pardee School of Global Studies, and Director, Boston University Global Development Policy Center. We have Dr. Rishikesh Ram Bhandari, Assistant Director, Global Economic Governance Initiative, Boston University Global Development Policy Center. We have Dr. Howard Horton, who is the author, Leadership and Governance, Diversity and Inclusion, Finance and Risk Management Expert. We have Mr. Joala Rambaran, Senior Advisor, Financial Futures Center, Distinguished Fellow, Climate Works Foundation. And we have Dr. Daniel Titelman, Non-Resident Senior Fellow, Global Economic Governance Initiative. And of course, we have Ms. Afrin Mahbub, CPD's Research Associate, who will make the presentation. So I think without further ado, let us get going. To start with, I will request Ms. Afrin Mahbub to make a presentation. So the proceedings will be such that after Afrin's presentation, I will request Kevin to make his special remarks, and then we will launch the report, and then that will be followed by special remarks by Professor Rehman Sobhan, Chairman of CPD, and then I'll request the panelists to make their remarks. So over to you, Afrin. She will make a very brief presentation. The report has already been published on the website of Boston University's Global Development Center. So Afrin, you have about 10 minutes? 15? Okay. Okay. Yeah, it's a big report, so yes, please start.
Thank you, ma'am. Distinguished speakers, panelists, good evening to you all, and welcome to the high-level dialogue on achieving debt sustainability in the face of climate change. The paper that I will be presenting on is titled Navigating Debt, Development and Disasters, Making Debt Sustainability Analysis Work for Bangladesh. And apart from myself, this paper has been co-authored by Dr. Famida Khatun, Executive Director, CPD, Mr. Syed Yusuf Sadat, Economist, UNDP, and Ms. Zaziba Waziha Sadeh. In addition, I would like to acknowledge that this paper was written as part of the Task Force on Climate Development and the International Financial Architecture in collaboration with the Global Development Policy Center, Boston University, and the Center for Policy Dialogue. In recent times, the macroeconomic management in Bangladesh has experiencing exorbitant challenges due to several factors, which includes structural deficiencies, insufficient policy frameworks, ineffective policy execution, poor governance practices, and the inability to enact vital reforms. In addition, I would like to mention that a considerable portion of Bangladesh's current macroeconomic difficulties is stemming from poor performance of the external sector and the uncertainty surrounding external balances. This is important because this means that the completing LDC graduation process in 2026 would require Bangladesh to transform its development plan substantially. These challenges are further compounded by climate change issues. These issues are further compounded due to climate change challenges. This is because Bangladesh is a highly vulnerable, climate vulnerable country experiencing frequent floods, cyclones, earthquakes, and storms, which means that additional financing needs may exceed the government budget, requiring further external loans, which inadvertently increases the external debt burden for Bangladesh. Which brings us to the need of this paper is that assessing debt sustainability analysis also requires incorporating adverse shocks, which is linked to climate change indicators, especially indicators linked to loss and damages, such as from floods, storms, and other related disasters. Which brings us to the main objective of the paper, which is to evaluate the impact of climate change on Bangladesh's debt sustainability by integrating climate-related risks and climate transition financing needs into the debt sustainability analysis. Now let's talk about a little bit of Bangladesh's current external debt burden. Currently, Bangladesh's debt burden is deemed to be sustainable so far. This is because Bangladesh is known to effectively manage its debt with a notable absence of defaults on debt repayments or requests for rescheduling. However, it is important to note that this is the case because a majority of Bangladesh's budget is being contributed to financing in debts, which means that it creates a trade-off, as increasing allocation to debt repayment may limit funds available for investments in crucial sectors which are important for economic growth. In addition, I also would like to mention that there has been a steady increase in the portion of non-concessional loans in the portfolio, and the conditions for borrowing are becoming more stringent with short grace periods and maturity periods. In addition, over the past few years, Bangladesh has taken a lot of loans with variable interest rates, which are subjected to many fluctuations, and these are clear indications of a forthcoming rise in debt servicing liabilities in the near and medium term. So that brings us to the question that is Bangladesh's debt burden really sustainable? In addition, we can see that if we compare some of the debt burden indicators, the external debt to GDP ratio is on the rise, accounting for 15.9% in fiscal year 2023. In addition, if you look at the indicators pertaining to debt to exports and debt to revenue collection, we can see that both of these indicators are gradually increasing, which means that the growth of export volume and the growth of revenue generation is slower than the growth of external debt volume. Now, if we talk a little bit about the climate finance, we can also see that the total revised budget allocation for climate change as a percent of GDP has stagnated around 1% since 2016 till 2024. In addition, budget utilization has also been ineffective as most of the budget is being contributed towards non-development expenditures rather than development expenditure, which creates a cause for concern, meaning that even though funding is increased for climate-related initiatives, the country's budget utilization is a cause for concern. Now, due to the interest of time, I would like to move on to the methodology section, which is basically highlighting the main findings of the report. The paper used the low-income countries' debt sustainability framework as a foundation to assess the current state of debt burden indicators for Bangladesh. Now, the LIC DSF is a standardized analytical tool which has been designed by the IMF and the World Bank to assess the risk of debt distress in a low-income country. This framework further evaluates the capability of a country to manage its debts. More so, this framework divides the assessment into two scenarios. One is the baseline scenario, and the other is a scenario that accounts for unexpected adverse situations. Now, stemming from this ideology and aligning with this framework, this study also utilized 4 external debt burden indicators to evaluate Bangladesh's possible debt distress under a baseline scenario and other counterfactual scenarios which have been deemed as adverse shocks or stress tests. The 4 debt burden indicators in question has further been divided into solvency indicators, which ensures long-term debt sustainability, and liquidity indicators, which ensures short-term ability to service its debt. Under solvency indicators, we have included the present value of external debt to GDP ratio and the present value of external debt to exports ratio. In addition, under the liquidity indicators, we've included the external debt service to exports ratio and the external debt service to revenue ratio. Furthermore, the data has been compiled and consolidated for the years from 1994 to 2023. This is considered as a baseline scenario, which represents the current status of Bangladesh's economy. In addition, we have applied 4 hypothetical scenarios, which we are terming as stress tests, and these include economic loss and damage due to climate change, converting climate loans to grants, hypothetical scenario which exhibits a decline in GDP, revenue, and exports due to the European Union's CBAM policy tool, another hypothetical scenario where variable international interest rates are increasing. Finally, the baseline and the stress test scenarios are compared against a threshold of debt carrying capacity, and the threshold for Bangladesh was assumed to be medium as per IMF's debt sustainability analysis. Now, the ideology is if both the indicators under the baseline and stress test scenario reach the threshold, it would indicate that Bangladesh is at a high risk of debt distress. Now, going over to the main findings of the report. So the first scenario which we are going to talk about is the economic loss and damage due to climate change, which has been applied as a stress test. It is expected that the economic impact of climate change will further increase the government's debt burden and endanger its ability to repay future loans. Stemming from this ideology, we have come up with two assumptions. The first assumption is that the government may attempt to borrow more money from development partners to account for climate change, further worsening the amount of debt owed to international organizations. The second assumption states that the expenditure for climate action is an additive expenditure, along with the debt service payments that the government is obligated to meet. Therefore, the economic impact represented by the total loss and damage incurred was later added to the present value of external debt and the debt service payments, and the ratio were recalculated further and exhibited as a stress test. This is the findings of the first scenario, where 4 graphs represent the 4 debt burden indicators. In the first figure, you would see that the recalculated external debt to GDP ratio does not breach the threshold. The threshold is also not breached at the baseline scenario as well. The similar phenomenon is seen for the external debt to exports ratio as well, which indicate that with regards to its solvency indicators, at least, Bangladesh is at a low risk of debt distress. And even while accounting for climate change, Bangladesh's debt burden will still remain sustainable. Conversely, with respect to the liquidity indicators, it can be seen that, at least for the external debt service to exports ratio, the threshold is breached for the stress test, which indicate that Bangladesh is at a moderate risk of debt distress with regards to this particular indicator. Similarly, if we move on to the external debt service to revenue indicator, we can see that the threshold is breached both at the baseline scenario and at the stress test scenario, indicating a high risk of debt distress. Moving on to the second scenario, which creates a hypothetical setting where climate change-related loans are transformed into grants. Bangladesh requires substantial amount of climate finance to address the vulnerabilities caused by climate change. Depending on external loans for climate finance will worsen the debt burden and weaken its debt servicing capacity. Therefore, if such loans were treated as grants, Bangladesh could reduce its debt burden, particularly over the long term. Therefore, for this particular exercise, we have assumed reclassified climate-related loans as grants and deducted those amount from external debt and corresponding external debt service payments. The results are as such that for the solvency indicators, which includes external debt to GDP and external debt to exports, the threshold was not breached either on the baseline scenario or the stress test scenario, indicating a positive situation if climate loans were treated as grants. A similar phenomenon was also seen in the liquidity indicators, where the threshold was not breached in either of the scenarios, which further strengthens the argument that if climate loans are treated as grants, Bangladesh's debt burden will reduce significantly. For the third scenario, we have designed another hypothetical setting where the GDP revenue and exports are expected to fall due to the introduction of the European Union's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. Now, what is the CBAM? It is a policy tool introduced by the European Union to mitigate the adverse effects of climate change to international trade policy. Currently, it is in a transitional phase. However, after the transitional phase, the CBAM will be fully operational. Now, while this initiative aims to raise awareness and hold countries accountable for activities that elevate climate change, it also poses a risk for Bangladesh. This is because implementing such international policy measures will increase the cost of exports from Bangladesh to the EU, particularly affecting the RMG exports, therefore resulting in a loss of export revenue. Therefore, considering this as a scenario was essential to assess the debt distress for Bangladesh in a scenario where CBAM is implemented. So for this particular exercise, the paper assumed that under the CBAM policy, Bangladesh's export may decline by 5%. Debt burden indicators were then again recalculated based on this assumption. Furthermore, it was also assumed that nominal GDP current revenue will also fall by the same percentage, reflecting the interlinkages between exports, GDP, and the government revenues. However, to also encapsulate the multidimensional factors of an economy, the effects of climate change, particularly economic loss and damage, were also accounted for when conducting the exercise as a stress test. This combined scenario captures dual challenges of climate vulnerability and export decline, providing a realistic stress test for Bangladesh's debt sustainability under adverse conditions. Now, the results are as such that for the solvency indicators, they are less volatile with respect to liquidity indicators, meaning GDP has to be reduced by as much as at least 55% to have a particular change or to breach the threshold under the stress test. Similarly, exports would have to be reduced by at least 40% for the external debt to exports to breach the threshold. However, conversely, liquidity indicators were much more volatile. A 5% reduction in exports would mean that recalculated ratio for external debt service to exports would breach the threshold, exhibiting a moderate risk for Bangladesh's debt distress. On the other hand, external debt service to revenue, if exports are reduced by 5%, then external debt service to revenue ratio will breach the threshold along with the baseline scenario signifying a high risk of debt distress. The fourth and final scenario sets a hypothetical setting where variable interest rates on loans taken in the past increase. Bangladesh's development has been supported by significant loans and grants from various development partners. However, the paper examines how variable international rates affect debt sustainability. Why is it important? This is because these rates fluctuate frequently over the time of the debt servicing period. Therefore, a fourth scenario such as this assesses the impact of interest rate changes on Bangladesh's external debt. To conduct this exercise, the variable interest rates for each loan from different development partners were increased by 0.5% intervals, starting at 0.5% and ending at 2.5%. Then the ratios for external debt burden indicators were recalculated again for all the years. Now, these updated values were then used to compute new debt burden ratios, specifically for present value of external debt to GDP and present value of external debt to exports. In addition, the liquidity indicators were also recalculated, which includes the external debt service to exports and external debt service to revenue. The results are deemed as such that with relevance to the solvency indicators, there hasn't been any breach in the threshold, which means that even if variable interest rates change over the long term, the indicators which include external debt to GDP and external debt to exports will remain unchanged and sustainable in the long run. However, the liquidity indicators seem to be much more volatile. This is because the recalculated external debt service to exports will breach the threshold even if the interest rates are increased by 0.5%, exhibiting a moderate risk of debt distress. Lastly, if external debt service to revenue, if interest rates are increased by a meager 0.5%, the external debt service to revenue ratio will breach the threshold in addition to the baseline scenario, indicating a high risk of debt distress. Now, to summarize the findings, I would like to emphasize on the fact that comparing the solvency indicators and liquidity indicators, solvency indicators are less volatile than liquidity indicators. What does this mean? It means that in the long run, Bangladesh's debt burden may seem sustainable. However, in the short term, Bangladesh may run into liquidity crisis and may face challenges in servicing and debt payments owing to the challenges imposed by climate change. In addition, it's also important to understand that rising external debt contributes to macroeconomic instability, with variable interest rates posing as a major challenge. Moreover, since Bangladesh's borrowing has shifted from concessional to commercial loans, from multilateral to bilateral, and towards shorter grace periods and maturity periods, this does also pose a significant challenge. This is further compounded by the fact that Bangladesh has a low tax to GDP ratio, which limits its ability to service debt. In addition, we also have low foreign reserves, and an adverse balance of payment situation further worsens the current situation. In this regards, the paper has also posed a set of few policy recommendations, which includes strengthening climate data and ensuring effective management of climate finance. Having a repository of climate data and accurate assessments of climate change's true economic effects will support the design of comprehensive policy tools. In addition, proper climate finance management ensures efficient use of external loans to build resilience, reducing the need for additional borrowing. Integrating climate risks into debt sustainability. Climate change indicators, which includes valuations of total damage, should be integrated in the Bangladesh debt sustainability projection. This approach enables a realistic assessment of current and future debt distress risks, which will also help policymakers design effective debt management strategies. Leveraging the loss and damage fund. Climate-induced economic loss and damage heighten Bangladesh's risk of debt servicing challenges. Therefore, it is important that such disasters often demand immediate and substantial fiscal support from the government. So Bangladesh should effectively seek financial assistance from the Loss and Damage Fund established at COP28. Safeguarding exports under the CBAM. The full implementation of EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism could threaten Bangladesh's debt sustainability in the near future. Therefore, urgent action is needed to reduce emissions and strengthen export resilience against the CBAM-related challenges. Prioritizing grants for climate finance. As exhibited in the findings of the paper, climate finance should be provided as grants rather than loans to reduce Bangladesh's risk of debt distress. Lastly, managing variable interest rates to minimize debt risk is very important. Variable interest rate loans in Bangladesh's external debt portfolio pose high financial risk. Therefore, to mitigate risk, Bangladesh should avoid taking additional loans with variable interest rates. Finally, strengthening domestic resource mobilization is very significant. Poor domestic resource mobilization is causing rising primary budget deficit, which makes it harder to service future external debt without incurring additional borrowing. Therefore, Bangladesh must increase tax revenue, expand the tax base, and improve compliance. Reducing illicit financial outflows is essential to avoid debt traps and perpetual indebtedness. Thank you very much. That will be all from my side.
Thank you very much, Afrin, for presenting. That was an exhaustive presentation, but you managed quite well of a report which is large. So now I would like to request Dr. Kevin P. Gallagher, Professor, Boston University Pardee School of Global Studies and Director, Boston University Global Development Policy Center. So Kevin, over to you.
See you all. First and foremost, I'm very sorry I'm not there in person like my friends Jwala and Rishi. We are just about to leave, or some of us already back from the World Bank annual meetings and couldn't be there. Really want to congratulate the team at CPD for this groundbreaking report, and it's really on the frontier and really taking a lead. I think for those of us who were just in Washington this week, it's pretty clear that leadership on the both technical and political level on these issues is not going to be coming from the Washington-based institutions, but coming from places like DACA and like the CPD report. So congratulations on the report. It's really important. Let me take a step back and put this a little in context and then make a comment or two on the report and put it in context. Despite what folks were trying to avoid talking about in Washington over the past week, it's clear that we need a massive mobilization of resources in the global economy to invest in low carbon, nature resilient, socially equal, and climate resilient economic growth paths. But that is going to take a stepwise increase in investment. Most of the estimates say that that's going to require an additional 3.5% of GDP of investment in countries across the world to be invested not just in adaptation and mitigation as scientists think about it, but in new economic growth paths that not only reduce carbon, make countries more adaptive, but create jobs and prosperity for the people in their countries. And like was alluded to, Bangladesh may have just graduated, and I commend and applaud the country for graduating from LDC status. I had the privilege of being on the Committee for Development Policy that happily voted for Bangladesh's graduation, but there's still a long way to go with a number of people in your country. So we need massive amounts of investment in a four-pronged strategy. One, we need to mobilize financing in a stepwise manner. I think the report says that at the highest level, climate finance in Bangladesh was around 0.84% of Bangladesh's GDP, but that needs to at least triple. But it's not just about raising financing. It's about what you're going to do with the financing, and what as we see from this paper, what the cost of capital is on that financing. There's two key parts of literally the equation here. One is, what is the weighted average of the cost of capital of all that financing? Well, some of that financing can come directly from Bangladesh's fiscal budget, but a lot of it will have to be raised in domestic and international capital markets. And our rule of thumb there is that the weighted average of the cost of capital has to be lower than the projected growth rate. So number one, as this tool in this report identifies, it's of utmost importance to make sure that the cost of capital or across all of the, especially external financing opportunities, is low. And as Bangladesh has graduated and continues now to have a broader mix of potential financing services, it will have to be careful about which ones to choose at which points in time. Private capital markets are notoriously pro-cyclical, meaning when countries like Bangladesh are doing really well, financing will surge into the country. But when something in Bangladesh might trigger a concern, or even more often than that, when something outside of Bangladesh might trigger a concern, or a high interest rate, or an AI bubble, which many of us think is right around the corner, then capital tends to retreat from countries like Bangladesh, which not only has importance for its lack of the ability to finance things, but it has major impacts on a country like yours, exchange rate and macroeconomic stability. So number one, it's really important to mobilize new financing, but number two, it's really important to make sure that that financing is relatively affordable. And on the other side of that equation is to make sure that it's invested in those kinds of economic growth paths that are not only low carbon, pro nature, socially inclusive, and resilient, but that actually cause economic growth. Because if there isn't economic growth, then it'll be harder to service these debts. And if you're not servicing the debts, then you can get involved in a debt overhang, which Bangladesh has unfortunately had experienced in different times in your economic history. So that's why this paper is so key. But thirdly, while mobilizing this finance and investing it in economic growth paths that are green, Bangladesh has to make sure that there are buffers there to respond to a new multitude of economic shocks. Not just climate shocks like the floods and droughts that are prevalent in the area, but interest rate shocks, wars and sanctions outside of Bangladesh, and bubbles that might happen outside of the world economy, as I alluded to earlier, where many of us are very concerned about perhaps the bursting of a AI bubble in the global north. So the key message of this huge mobilization for both investment and growth and for responding to shocks is not just the total amount of money, the ability for that money to be invested in growth paths and in absorbing shocks, but it has to be done in a manner that is fiscally sound and financially stable. And that is what this little known sort of obscure tool called the debt sustainability analysis is supposed to help countries gauge. And unfortunately, the way that the International Monetary Fund and World Bank's debt sustainability analysis tool currently works is that it doesn't incorporate those four core concerns that I just outlined. Indeed, the sort of fundamental premise of an IMF World Bank debt sustainability analysis tool is, under the current structure of international financial markets and the domestic context of a particular country's budget constraints, how much can you spend or under certain constraints. Whereas what we know is that we need to mobilize an incredible amount of financing, and a debt sustainability analysis tool should be what kinds of capital under what interest rates will you need to be able to meet those different investment goals. But unfortunately, that's not how the tool is currently structured. Right now, it has a number of flaws. A number of studies have been done. Number one, that show that on average, most debt sustainability analyses from the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund have very, very high estimates, overly high estimates on what the growth potential for a particular country is and what the government revenue will be. And if those two parts are overestimates, then the debt burdens are somewhat masked. Number two, when the government does spend money on gross fixed capital formation or investment, uh, World Bank and IMF DSAs do not have what are called multiplier effects. We know that on average, that government multipliers are about 1.3, 1.4% across the literature, meaning that for every $1 that the government spends, that's going to generate not only that whole dollar back, but another 40.4% of GDP and other kinds of economic activity. DSAs from the IMF and the World Bank don't include that sort of fundamental understanding about government and public investment. Number three, that the DSAs that are done by the IMF and the World Bank immediately request that a country go into massive fiscal consolidation if it meets certain thresholds. And rather than, like I alluded to earlier, rather than saying, well, here is the level of investment that this country needs to be able to raise the standards of living of its people without having an impact on the climate, and therefore what's the right mix of costs of capital and as you model in the paper, grants versus loans, they immediately are geared in their inner workings of the mathematics inside of these tools, say that once you hit a certain threshold, well, then you automatically have to get into fiscal consolidation, and therefore, by definition, putting these investments on hold for a long period of time. These tools also do not incorporate shocks, such as the CBAM that is modeled in this particular paper, interest rate shocks that might happen, and different bubbles outside of the country. And so that's why this paper is so important and so pioneering, because from the ground up there in Bangladesh, you know that you have been a significant victim of loss and damage, potentially of CBAMs, of different kinds of shocks, and different and your debt portfolio over time has been subject to different interest rates that are beyond your control. And so you have done a real life adaptation of what DSA would look like, modifying the IMF and World Bank's methodology to incorporate these very real realities when it comes to climate change investment and growth in Bangladesh. And the results are quite interesting and quite sobering on some levels. I think the one thing that I would add that would be an interesting scenario is to have a fifth stress test in the paper that examined the extent to which, if there was a huge increase in investment under different interest rate scenarios, what might the impact be on debt sustainability? Because if I'm reading the paper right, this is all analyzing the extent to which the 0.84% of GDP investments in climate finance are sustainable. But obviously, as you know better than me, because you're there, Bangladesh needs to invest significantly into green growth paths, but also have buffers there to respond to the myriad of economic and climate shocks that unfortunately plague the country on a regular basis. So it would be interesting to see what the stress test scenarios would look like under under those conditions. So to take another step back, what can the global community, what can multilateral development banks and the International Monetary Fund do to help countries like Bangladesh and think about this on the MDB side? First and foremost, they need to be much bigger. The real levels of lending from the MDBs have not increased since the 1970s. But in the 1970s, we weren't talking about these issues. We weren't talking about climate shocks. We weren't talking about the needs to change the structure of our economies to make them low carbon and socially resilient. And so, first of all, we just need more financing. But obviously, more financing is not enough. That financing needs to be affordable. Right now, World Bank loans, many other countries in Asia are turning away World Bank loans because they're too expensive. And this is something as Bangladesh graduates from out of LDC status, but is already far beyond LIC status or low income country status, that you're increasingly more eligible for what are called non-concessional financing windows, which are right now are close to 5.5 or 6%, which in some years Bangladesh has had some incredible growth rates like that, but over the long run, that's hard to expect, and and that's just what they would be. So number one, the multilateral development banks have to be much bigger so that they can expand their lending for work that we've done here at the Global Development Policy Center for the Baku to Belém roadmap process in Brazil for the COP this year. We estimate that the MDBs need to at least triple the amount of financing that they are lending to countries. But number two, they need to really be focusing on the weighted average of the cost of capital. This capital needs to be much cheaper. And that's a big concern at the particular moment. Just coming back from Washington, the appetite to replenish and expand concessional windows of these multilateral development banks is at an all-time low, especially with the major shareholder and some of the other major shareholders in Europe for obvious reasons. The third thing that the MDBs need to do, in addition to more lending, making it more affordable, is channeling it towards what countries' national strategies for growth. Sometimes the MDBs have an idea of what climate change policy and climate change projects should look like, and they will only provide financing to a country like Bangladesh if Bangladesh proposes projects and policies that look like what the MDBs want. But with all due respect to them, they don't necessarily have their boots on the floor in a particular country, and what they think is important for a climate growth path is not necessarily tuned to the national strategies and the national conditions of a particular country. And so rather than the MDBs telling countries what a right climate strategy should be, they should be financing homegrown climate strategies and development strategies. On the International Monetary Fund, one of the things, even though that the DSA that we are talking about today is jointly conducted by the IMF and the World Bank, the heavy hand on it is really on the IMF side, and they really need to be reforming the debt sustainability analysis. And this paper is an incredible step forward in pointing not just in general where the fund should be reforming this tool, but specifically as you've applied it to these four different scenarios in the Bangladesh case, which has major insights. And what makes this paper and report so timely is that right now, as we speak, the IMF, World Bank, DSA is under review. And there were a number of workshops here in Washington over the past week on how to reform that tool, and this paper really speaks to the heart of those conversations. In addition to improving this tool, which is so important. Bangladesh obviously has an International Monetary Fund program right now. And so it's important not only for surveillance and advice to countries like Bangladesh, but it also is important in the design of actual programs in the event that a country needs an IMF program. And programs sometimes happen over a period where new shocks can happen. And the second thing that the fund needs to do, which is clear from the stress test in this paper, is incorporate debt pause clauses in their financing programs. The World Bank, to its credit, is now piloting pause clauses for natural disasters and climate shocks and other related kinds of shocks. The World Bank it deserves credit for that, but the International Monetary Fund needs to follow and align with that. Thirdly, the programs that the fund has need to align with helping a country accelerate its climate growth paths rather than put them on hold or maybe derail them for a long period. In the global north, when we have recessions and shocks, countries like my own can draw on and access Federal Reserve swaps, central bank swaps that allow us to engage in expansionary monetary and indirectly fiscal policy to get ourselves out of slowdowns and so forth. However, as you know through your own IMF program, the majority of countries in the world, especially the lower income countries, they don't have access to those Fed swaps and they have to go to the International Monetary Fund. And while the global north engages in expansionary monetary and fiscal policy, the conditions under which financing is available under the International Monetary Fund is the opposite. It conditions new financing on contractionary fiscal consolidation and austerity policies that could derail investment growth paths for climate resilience, low carbon, and social equity. So that's important to reform the financing packages of the IMF. Of course, the fund does have a new climate-related instrument referred to as the RST, the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, or the Resilience and Sustainability Fund, which Bangladesh has benefited from. But as you know better than me, because you have access to this particular instrument, it's only on top of the fiscal consolidation program that you have. And so while that does offer some ring fencing of particular climate-related investments, the amount of financing that comes from the RST relative to the upper tranche program that you have is so small that actually the effects might counteract each other and be significant. Another thing that the IMF needs to work on is global surveillance. It does multilateral surveillance and it does bilateral surveillance. Obviously, it comes to Bangladesh, it looks at your books and financing and gives you advice. But as the only global rules-based institution that is supposed to be looking at the fiscal and financial stability of the entire global economy, its global surveillance needs to be more climate aligned. It should be looking through its bilateral surveillance at studies like this and incorporating that kind of thing into the debt sustainability analyses for Bangladesh. And it would immediately recognize that Bangladesh needs a lower cost of capital, more grants, etc., like are identified in this particular study. And then in its global surveillance analyses, it should be telling the world that we need larger sources of grant financing at the Green Climate Fund and other things like that, and that interest rates are too low, are too high for developing countries, as they mobilize this kinds of research and resources. So that's really important. But unfortunately, just coming from Washington, that leadership is not something we can be holding our breath on. The multilateral development banks and the International Monetary Fund, as we know, are fundamentally skewed where the United States has outsized power, where it can veto all of the major decisions and has a major thumbprint on all the decisions that happen at the fund and the bank. And in the remarks of the United States Secretary of the Treasury this week, called on the bank and the fund to eliminate and downplay its work on climate change. The current government of the United States does not see climate change the way that CPD does, the way that Bangladesh has to experience on a day. They don't understand the science. And therefore, by not understanding the science, they don't understand that there's a need for a change in investment rates and patterns in the global economy, and therefore the debt sustainability component of it is not something of their concern. So even though, as I said earlier, the IMF is right now reviewing its debt sustainability analysis, and they invite people like Dwala and Rishi and myself to the workshops that they have on this, and they listen to us in a very nice way, talking about climate change and the need to incorporate them. But there is absolutely no way under the current structure of the shareholding and with the current U.S. government as the major shareholder in the fund, there's no way that the DSAs will be reformed in a way that will allow them to be appropriate tools to move forward on these crucial issues. And that's why this study is so important, because leadership now has to come at the country and national level and through South-South cooperation and South-South institutions. And this paper shows that Bangladesh can take its own leadership. This paper was done by a pioneering think tank there in Bangladesh that shows that countries have the capability to do this right, to do these debt sustainability analyses right. And so a key national thing that national policymakers in Bangladesh should do is to work with CPD to incorporate this kind of a debt sustainability analysis into their own debt management strategies and their own debt policies, because the leadership will not be coming from the fund on this. And so this should become the elements of an official debt sustainability analysis that's done at the finance ministry in Bangladesh. And then when the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank comes for, say, an Article 4 consultation under the IMF, and they have a debt sustainability analysis that says one thing, then Bangladesh can hold up something based on this study and say, well, actually, we see it differently, and therefore we need different kinds of financing under different conditions. The second thing that I would encourage Bangladesh to do, in addition to doing its own debt sustainability analysis to create healthy competition with the analyses that will be lackluster at best given the current structure of the International Monetary Fund, is don't do it alone, is to engage in South-South cooperation on these issues to be able to expand it across the global South. Bangladesh is a member of the SARC, which is the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation. The SARC has a currency swap network, which on some levels is an alternative to the internet, or at least a supplement to the International Monetary Fund. The SARC could also bolster its debt sustainability analyses as it engages in surveillance in member countries. And this paper speaks to how the SARC could have a modified and enhanced debt sustainability analysis that could give better results and give better guidance to countries across the membership, and allow the SARC to identify different kinds of instrumentation it might need to be able to help countries. So number one, lead nationally with these kinds of tools. Number two, engage in South-South cooperations in places like the SARC. Bangladesh is also now a member of the New Development Bank, or the BRICS Bank. This is a bank that has a significant amount of capital, but doesn't have Washington as a member. But the third thing, which I guess is more of a plea, But since you're in the middle of an IMF program and have a portfolio of MDB loans, it's obviously in your interest as well, is to, even though the international finance, institutions are abandoning you in the short term, don't abandon them in the intermediate and long term. You need to be a force and a voice of reform. These institutions need to be significantly reformed along the lines that I just talked about. And this particular paper shows how easy it is for the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank to reform its debt sustainability analysis tool. Of course, their economists are not as smart as the CPD economists that did this particular study, but of course you would be happy to train some of the folks at the IMF to be able to get this kind of thing right. And it really shows that under better conditions, the fund and the bank could be reformed along these lines. And this paper is such a step forward and shows exactly how a more politically neutral and economically correct way of thinking about these issues can be incorporated into this toolkit. So let me just end there, commend the folks there for this great study, and please use it as a tool at home in Bangladesh with your friends in the region through SARC and beyond, but also, and this is something that your fellow members in this task force for climate change development and the international financial architecture will do, is hold it up and engage with the Western-backed institutions to show them exactly how this particular tool can be reformed. So thanks so much for the opportunity, and I wish I was there, not because you folks are so much more fun to hang out with than people in Washington, but it is now turning into autumn here, and it's much colder here than it is in Dhaka, and wish I was there with warm friends and in a warm climate. I wish you the best of workshops here. Thanks so much for the opportunity to share some of my thoughts.
Thank you very much, Kevin, for those words. Those are really very insightful. You have given the whole landscape of the global financial architecture and its relevance for Bangladesh in the context of climate change, and a number of important suggestions, actually. So not only reform of the international financial institutions, but also how the nationally driven policies should be pursued, and South-South cooperation, and also suggesting the international organizations for their reform. And thank you very much for the nice words. And we also wish you were here. In fact, in Dhaka also the weather is cooling down, so it's quite pleasant compared to the summer. Thank you very much once again. Now I would request our chairman, Professor Rema Sobhan, to make his remarks. So we'll do the launching later, but we would like to listen to Professor Rema Sobhan.
Thank you, Fahmida. I won't take up too much time because this is not my area of expertise, and I'm more in the position of being educated on the issues raised over here, and therefore I would like to commend the CPD team on the enormously interesting and informative analytical and work and data they have assembled to address this issue. How far this will be of any use or will be made use of by the government of Bangladesh when they are working out their own debt sustainability analysis remains to be seen. I'm also grateful to Kevin Gallagher for giving a broad coverage of the landscape of debt and sustainability and the issues of climate finance. I will simply raise some issues which I hope will be addressed by the speakers, because there are people here with specialized expertise in these areas. SADC in particular should be particularly informed about the issue of Bangladesh's debt sustainability. I mean, there are, of course, two narratives built into this analysis. The one deals with the issue of debt sustainability, which is a major issue of its own right, which can be addressed independently of the impact of the climate crisis. And then, of course, there's the impact of climate change itself, which is another independent problem. What needs to really be more clearly brought out over here, if you are bringing both these two issues into the same discussion, is to get some sense of the marginal cost of climate change on the issue of debt sustainability. That are we basically dealing with unique shocks which may occur periodically, or which have to be then costed into the analysis? Or are we looking for long-term movements in the climate change impact on the economy, which will mean that there will be an exponential growth in costs related to climate? Because if you essentially look at the table which has been presented in this paper, they've presented or attempted to present annual estimations of the costs of climate effects on every year, which is a very useful exercise. But what we have to take into account is whether there is a rightward movement in the curve where you are taking into account the fact that these costs are now going to be generally higher. I mean, you have done 5-year averages, but these, of course, have been weighted by the high costs of a particular climate episode in a particular year, but whether there is, in fact, developments taking place in the area of climate change, which will be a cost we have to carry at a much higher level. Now, as far as I see it over here, the two critical elements which have been brought out in the paper relate, of course, to the domestic response, and this has to be then related to the broader global climate in which debt sustainability has to be maintained. As far as Bangladesh is concerned, the critical element over here, as far as we are concerned, relates to the way in which we handle the problem. Now, tables have been given over here indicating that we are allocating around 4 to 5% of the development budget, much lower naturally in relation to GDP. Now, whether this is high or low needs to be related to what we are estimating as the marginal costs of climate events. Now, this has not really been made clear. I mean, we have tables giving yearly estimates of costs. What would have been useful over here is if these costs could be related to the expenditures in that year spent on addressing issues of climate. There are two independent tables on this, but these two tables needed to be brought together to estimate that given a particular cost in that year, how much of it was being covered by the budget allocations which have been made. Because obviously there are two components to this. One is the costs of specific events which have taken place, whether a flood, dealing with a flood, a cyclone, or some other factor. And the other are what we relate as the climate change elements which have been brought in, which relate to adaptation and mitigation costs. These need to be sort of disaggregated and incorporated into your analysis. The other element which needs to be brought out, and this is a big failure I find in the way in which budgets are presented and analyzed in Bangladesh, is that we only look at the numbers when budgets are actually presented in terms of what has actually been allocated. And of course, some indication of what has been spent. In fact, in relation to utilization, the concerned agencies which have been utilizing the climate funds possibly are doing better than quite a number of other ministries in the government whose ability to utilize funds allocated to them are poor. But this itself tells us very little about the impact of the fund. And I think Kevin Gallagher has pointed this out, that what we fail to measure is the outcomes of public expenditures in particular areas. So what has actually been happening year to year in terms of what allocations have been made under the climate budget and what outcomes have come out of that, I have not seen any substantial literature on that subject, and certainly this is not an issue which has been addressed within the framework of this study. I think it is very important that not only do we have an assessment of the allocations, but the way in which allocations are used, and this would then give us a better understanding of whether we are needing to invest more resources into this sector than we actually have been. The other issue, of course, then, which is central to the analysis, is the element of external financing of climate-related issues. Now, again, it would have been very useful if we could have had a breakdown in terms of the actual expenditures in relation to climate change, as between external financing and domestic financing. I don't know whether I've missed that in anywhere in the study itself, but we need to get a understanding of the degree of external underwriting of this particular process, and whether in that sense we need this should be a particular sector which needs to be drawing in external funding more specifically targeted to this area, because obviously the costs as between different areas of the budget which are dependent on external financing is a variable element, and this needs to also be brought out. Finally, I would say that the issues, and I here look forward to what Sadiq has to say on this subject, is the issue of the terms on which we are accessing these funds. Now, obviously, the critical issue is how far the nature of Bangladesh's changing debt landscape is going to then impact on the costs of financing climate change. It has been pointed out in this study, and also has been pointed out that the costs of debt servicing are going to progressively increase as our circumstances change in the international aid scenario. If we are sort of moving out of the LDC category and we are moving into an area where we will have to undertake more high-cost financing for whatever programs we have, this will be needed to be factored in. Now, what is not clear is how the different types of financing are allocated in terms of the domestic budget. For example, programs related to climate change, are these being funded with higher interest borrowing, or are we trying to make sure that most of the grant financing that we are actually getting can be and is being diverted for programs of climate change, because these are obviously not income generating projects, and therefore they cannot then service debt internally from the outcome of that particular investment. Here again, it would be useful if the analysis could make this particular distinction about sources of financing. Kevin has again pointed out that we are operating, of course, within changing global landscape. He has rightfully pointed out to what I suppose we should call the Trump variable in international finance, where we have to take into account how the US position is going to impact on the availability of funding. Obviously, if you have the world's most influential regime taking a position that climate change is really a non-problem, then this is going to impact, I think, both on the way in which the international community reacts, both commercially as well as in terms of its sort of aid allocations, whether people will be coming forward to compensate for the withdrawal of funding originating from the US administration, or whether this will in fact set standards for how they will conduct financing is going to be an important factor in the future. Similarly, how the commercial financing element in climate finance will be responsive to positions which are actually taken by a major player such as the US is very important. I would conclude by saying that the climate for global finance itself is, I think, undergoing major structural changes. This is, of course, not central to this element. But the notion that we should be exclusively dependent on a particular architecture for financing climate change, which has been put in place over sort of successive global events addressing this issue, is not the only game in town. I mean, the new sources of capital and the availability of capital surpluses is now structurally shifted eastwards into the Asian region. And major sources of finance are now available both in terms of aid as well as in terms of loans in the new funds which have emerged in this area, including from China. And so this has to now be incorporated into the way in which they can be brought into the action, and they can be brought into the action of underwriting climate finance. I am not competent to talk about how effective this is going to be, but I hope this can be brought in. So we've got a very interesting and valuable study available to us. I think there are areas in which the study can be deepened and amplified so that we can get a clearer understanding of how funds are used, allocative priorities, because we should remember that a budget is not, the size of the budget is not the only game in town. Within the budget, how you allocate it and how you utilize it is no less important. Then the other variable which has to be kept in mind, and here again Sadiq would be more qualified to talk about it, is that in the sustainability scenarios, you've always worked on assumptions such as reduced exports and reduced GDP, and of course changes in costs of financing. But of course, there is no reason why you should not also be more positive, and you should factor in what would be the impact of export growth, improved export growth and improved GDP growth. And this would have to be brought into the variables which are introduced into your analysis. To work on the assumption that there will be an actual absolute fall in exports and a fall in GDP, I'm not sure that that is a very useful way of looking at it. I mean, normally we talk of reduced rates of growth of exports and reduced rates of growth of GDP. What we do not talk about is absolute declines, which you would need a huge level of incompetence on the part of the government of Bangladesh, both present and future, if they actually create a scenario in which our exports go down. It hasn't happened yet, and I hope it will not happen in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for your valuable comments. We have 3 speakers online, and then we have 5 speakers here. I'll bring Sadiq Bhai later, bring him later, because we'd like to hear the others, and then I'll bring you sometime after. So let me go back to our online guests. I would like to request Mr. Jwala Rambaran to make his remarks. He is the Senior Advisor, Financial Futures Center, and Distinguished Fellow, Climate Works Foundation. Since we have 8 more speakers and we are running behind time, I would request our speakers to speak for about 5 to 6 minutes. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much, Famida. And in the interest of time, yes, I will keep my remarks pretty brief. First, at least let me congratulate you and the team on this report, which I think is extremely timely and relevant, because what you've done is actually undertake a debt sustainability analysis for an economy that is in transition from LDC status. And you've highlighted what are some of the key gaps that would typically exist within the IMF World Bank analysis. What I'll do, I'll just focus on what I consider to be 3 areas that are more policy related that come out from the analytical work that's done in this report. And the first relates to that in terms of the transition from LDC status into, let's call it middle income country status. And the fact that that means your volume of external concessional financing is likely to fall over time. But again, as with many other countries that are moving into this phase, there's a divorce, there's a disconnect between the structural vulnerability of the economy and the amount of financing, particularly concessional financing that's available. And here I'll say is we need to look at, some of the work that's been done by the United Nations on the creation of a multi-dimensional vulnerability index that takes into account vulnerability in other dimensions, such as climate, debt shocks, in addition to what exists in terms of using income as the only defining metric. And I think it's important to do that because then you look at that UN MVI to determine how relevant is that to Bangladesh's trajectory and whether there are gaps in that particular MVI that you could now strengthen and use as part of your advocacy for greater concessional funding. The second is the need to really build on innovative debt instruments that look to strengthen your fiscal resilience. Kevin spoke around the need for the debt pause clauses, and I think this is actually very critical as you move forward into the market and as you likely to make greater use of multilateral financing is to determine how these debt pause clauses are going to be, one, incorporated into the loan contracts, but two, when there's need for activation, how does the market react when that activation happens? And I think here is important to then look at the experience of Grenada, which was actually the pioneer in debt pause clauses. And after the advent of Hurricane Beryl last year, Grenada triggered its debt pause clause. So so you have a real life example of how these instruments are now operating. And you could get some very good lessons from that for Bangladesh. The other instrument I'll also make mention of is the debt for nature swaps that are regaining prominence as mechanisms that could support debt sustainability and biodiversity conservation. Of course, these debt swaps carry high transactions costs. They're very complex instruments. They require strong political will, and there's need to build out a deeper level of transparency and accountability. But I think those are more design, a lot of those are design elements that could be mitigated. The risk could be mitigated by proper consultation, particularly with the local communities and civil society groups where the actual projects are going to be implemented. And here is important to look at, like, I would highlight at least reference the Barbados 2024 debt swap, which for the first time really linked debt to adaptation and resilience, which is critical for Bangladesh as we move forward. And my final comment is really around the need for us to start moving away from the sort of post-disaster responses, which is what contributes to the debt buildup, and start to look at the need for early action and more um, pre-arranged type financing that is needed. And in that, I think is important to look at how we invest in resilience rather than waiting after the fact. The anticipatory side and the pre-arranged side, I think, is extremely critical. And I'll reference a recent study. This was actually released this week by the International Institute for Environment and Development. And they did some work on why these sorts of early investments in building out climate resilience is so critical. And they did some case studies, and Bangladesh is actually one of the countries that was used in that study. And here's what they found for Bangladesh. In the case of a 1 in 20-year disaster event, that would amount to about $2.3 billion in losses for Bangladesh. And if Bangladesh used its existing social programs to deal with those losses, it would have to spend about $10 billion. And if there was a humanitarian response to that disaster, Bangladesh would spend about 2.7 billion. However, if you build out anticipatory direct benefit transfer systems, you would only need to spend about $1.1 billion. And most importantly, if there was resilience investment done very early on, then the investment to Bangladesh would be only about $500 million, which says that there is significant room to look at how early stage resilience investments are done. And I'll close off by highlighting a key finding of this IID study is that every dollar invested in early resilience investments yield just over $5 in avoided losses and development gains. And that means that is less of a hit on Bangladesh's debt sustainability prospects. So I'll close off here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Juala, for your comments. So thank you, particularly everyone is speaking from a place where it is early morning. I'll come back to my panel here. I would like to request Mr. Asjadul Kibriya, who is the planning editor of the Financial Express. He works on financial issues, so he is also well positioned to make some remarks on this study.
Thank you, Chair. I'll be very brief. So I just want to focus on 2 points of the paper. The first one is the paper estimates the budget allocation for climate change, and I think it is a good exercise. And what is needed is some breakdown and some detail for the future work you may consider. So how to tag it and how to link on other sectors and sectoral issues in the climate change budget. So that will, I think that will help us to understand more on the budgetary allocation and budgetary spending on the climate change, and also the necessity of the domestic or the climate financing debt. And the second one is the suggestion you made in the paper that the climate finance should be provided as grants rather than loan. It is also a timely suggestion, I think, and there is little to differ with the suggestion. The question is to what extent Bangladesh will be able to attract the grant in the climate finance in near future, especially when the LDC graduation is taking place, and so it will be challenging. So that may be another exercise we can think of it. And also the issue of utilizing the fund, that is a critical thing. For every fund, we know that, but we know that over the years, a good number of climate adaptation fund has been misappropriated. There is an allegation also that the good number of fund on that they allocated and they used for in the name of the climate vulnerable people. That was also, there is no trace or properly what actually happened and where they go, who are the beneficiaries actually. There is no transparency on that issue. So I think that can be another work and ultimate outcome. So thank you again for the paper.
Thank you, Mr. Kibria, for these precise points. I would now request another media personality, Mr. Sajadur Rahman, who is the deputy editor of the Business Standard in Bangladesh, to make his remarks. Oh, okay. You want to make a presentation? Very short. 2-3 slides. Okay. Okay. Sure.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, CPD, for inviting me. Honorable Chair, distinguished guests and panelists, audiences, and my colleagues from the media. Good evening and assalamu alaikum. So it's a pleasure to attend this session because, we know just COP30, the Global Summit on Climate Change, is just 20 days away from today. So it is very time-befitting discussion. Actually, the report covered many points, and the distinguished speakers already pointed out many issues, so I will not repeat those points. But climate change and its impact, how it is, it is sometimes brutal for Bangladesh. If I just give you an example, I've seen in CPD's presentation that 25% of Bangladesh's area actually, affected by floods, monsoon floods every year. And for extreme event, it can be, 2/3 of the areas. So you can guess how it can affect Bangladesh because, 180 million people, they depend on this, solely locally produced rice, the main staple food. So if, 2/3 areas are flooded for extreme event, it can affect, not only crop production, but also employment because, agriculture, though it is, contribution to GDP is now 11-12%, but still it employs 45% people, and it has increased for the last few years because we know the COVID-19 impact and the consequent high inflation persistently that is affecting job creation, and people have many people have gone to farming. We know that. So how it is impacting this this climate shocks, and again Bangladesh, Bangladesh is borrowing to rebuild those infrastructures and buildings and everything, just to by borrowing from the development partners and bilateral partners. And Bangladesh is, if you see the slide, You see the quarterly data of Bangladesh Bank. Bangladesh's external debt position, you can see it is $112 at the end of the June quarter, and public sector is here over $92 billion, and private sector is nearly $20 billion. So it is growing every year. And if you see this, just recent data, fiscal year 24 and 25, if you see commitment is declining, disbursement is also declining, but on the other hand, you see debt servicing, principal, bit, or interest, or total, it is rising. That's a concern, really. Commitment is declining, disbursement is also declining, but the debt servicing burden is rising. And I think it will go up day by day and years to come. And if you see, most concerning issue is that, the market-based loan, that is rising very alarmingly. If you see fiscal year 20, only 15.8% was market-based loans. In fiscal year 25, it is nearly 43%. And it is estimated to cross 50% this fiscal year. So less concessional loan and higher market-based loan, floating rate, it cost 6 to 8%, with our concessional loan around 2% or less than 2%. So that's a real concern, and the questions will be, can Bangladesh actually service this cost in the years to come? And if you see just the immediate post fiscal year 25, Bangladesh has spent over $4 billion, just 50% jump from 3 years ago for debt servicing, over $4 billion. And it has been doubled in 3 years. And of which, 1.5 billion was spent for interest payment only, which was actually, if I say, just 200 million a decade ago. And Bangladesh is now paying nearly $200 million per month for interest payment only. So that's a real concern, I think, and why Bangladesh has to be cautious to take this foreign loan, because we have seen, during the past regime, Bangladesh was a high growth country, and Bangladesh was flying development myth, so and so. Our development partners, be it World Bank or ADB or others, they were just showcasing Bangladesh as a big success case and miracle of development. So that's, I think, they have given a lot of money without actually proper or Bangladesh actually did not need all those loans. That were the questions. Some say those actually like economic hitmen who actually just highlighted rosy pictures about the economy and feed them a lot of loans, so kind of things. And concessional loans, I'd say why we know it is declining, but we have to be cautious so that actually concessional loan we can get more and more. And see, already the report has covered how climate change appears as a debt multiplier, and we have seen that between 2009 and 2020, climate-related losses in Bangladesh rose nearly tenfold, from 184 billion to nearly 1,800 billion taka. So that's every disaster leads to new borrowing for embankment repair, displaced rehabilitation, and infrastructure rebuilding. So climate change has thus become a fiscal phenomenon, turning environmental shocks into debt shocks for Bangladesh. So I would just recommend some points. What should Bangladesh do as COP30 is approaching near? So some policy suggestions I can give. Already the point has come, private sector has to be engaged here. Quite often we see that, the government officials just handle these issues, though they are not very expert on this very, critical issues of, climate change and its impacts. So, my suggestion is we have to integrate climate stress test into every debt sustainability analysis. Second point is we have to cap exposure to variable rate loans to manage interest risk. Third point is, mobilize domestic resources, expand the tax base, reduce illicit outflows, and boost compliance. And we have to leverage blended finance, mix grants, concessional loans, and provide investment for adaptation projects. And we have to align trade and climate policies, especially within instruments like the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism. And final, push for global debt, climate swaps, allowing part of debt repayment to be redirected toward resilience. Climate swaps, swap is not new thing. It is happening from 1980s and 1990s. So Bangladesh should, go for it and should do the best to swap these loans, existing loans to, divert it to, climate resilience or mitigation or adaptation projects. So my closing thoughts is I hope today's discussion will help us, rethink what sustainability really means, not just in numbers, but in human and environmental terms. Because a debt that undermines resilience can never truly be sustainable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sajjadur Rahman. Now I would turn to Dr. Howard Houghton, who is online now. He is the author, Leadership and Governance, Diversity and Inclusion, Finance and Risk Management expert. So over to you, Dr. Howard. So I would urge and request that if you can limit your comments within 5 minutes. Thank you.
Also, let me start like probably everybody else in just congratulating you and all of the authors for what I think is a very comprehensive report, well written, very interesting for me, albeit the fact that I just read it yesterday. So I was grateful for the presentation because it filled a couple of gaps. I hadn't studied the document itself, but read through it as quickly as I could and found it to be very interesting. The other thing I should also say is, having spent a number of years looking at things like the DSA from the IMF and World Bank, it's always struck me as being a useful but not significantly value-added tool for sovereigns. And I think what you've done is you've tried to make it more real and realistic. And so I can only take my hat off to you for doing that. And I think that's very, very useful. One thing I would like to say, though, and in the interest of time, is really not to repeat what Kevin and others have said, but just to touch on areas that I think perhaps the document could benefit from. In particular, I see a sort of vicious cycle, if you will, and you've pointed or alluded to this in the document when you talk about illiquidity. For me, you can probably get to a point where you've got this vicious cycle whereby the lack of liquidity or poor liquidity or reduced liquidity in and of itself could cause insolvency. And it would have been nice to see a closer coupling between those two concepts. Clearly, the DSA doesn't do that in and of itself. And I think the work that you've done, perhaps there could be a closer link between the two. You can see an example whereby a lack of confidence, for example, from the marketplace could result in a requirement for, higher interest rates on the debt when you're looking to roll over the debt, for example. That in and of itself would obviously, cause rollover risks, liquidity risks associated with that, higher cost of financing the debt. In and of itself, that could also lead to other problems. It could lead to possible debt restructuring, which in and of itself could be tantamount to default, because quite a lot of loan clauses have debt restructuring as being tantamount to debt. So that's something that perhaps you could have weaved into the analysis. The other thing as well is that when you think about the impact of illiquidity, it could also have a detrimental impact on GDP. You did mention that, but the sort of lower tax revenues that you would get if you have lower GDP would also have an impact on solvency down the road. So looking at those causal effects would have been quite useful, in my opinion. And also looking at the sort of depletion of reserves that you would have, the impact that that would have on the foreign exchange, and the fact that you've got a certain percentage of debt in foreign currency would also exacerbate your long-term solvency, and that could also have been made a bit more explicit. I agree with earlier comments about looking at the upside as well as the downside in terms of GDP and looking at wider scenarios, in perhaps doing a simulation rather than just doing a sort of discrete number of what if type analysis, which is essentially what the DSA does. That would have been quite useful. And also coupling in the correlation between the different movements, because obviously, as you would be aware, sensitizing a large Excel spreadsheet by moving certain parameters in one direction and others in a different direction does suggest that there is a sort of it does suggest that there is a correlation that you're inducing in the movements, whereas if you were to model this more structurally, you could actually represent that more dynamically within some kind of simulation model. That would have been also quite useful. Another thing that I'd like to touch on is, and I've put a couple of links in the chat. There's some work that I did a couple of years ago, well, a few years ago, with a colleague that I was working with at the Commonwealth Secretariat, Jodie Keane. And while I had mentioned a couple of things actually relevant to those two links that I've put into the chat, some work that I did when I was looking at Caribbean countries in relation to, I guess, preventative maintenance when it comes to natural disasters speaks to Wilder's point. So I have a chapter in that book, and there are a number of other chapters in that book that I think would be quite useful. If you've not read it before, then I think it would be useful to have a look at that. Maybe you could sort of glean some stuff from that that could be fed back into or enhance your report in some way. Also, we did some work on debt swaps. Actually, although I say so myself, I think it's one of the more comprehensive pieces of work that was done, that was published through Wiley just a few years ago, around 2021, on debt swaps, within which I point out what are the key conditions for a successful debt swap, including looking at the social return on investment, which is often missing from the discourse when we talk about debt swaps. Quite often we speak about the sort of economic benefits, monetary returns, but of course there is a social return on investment, which could also be quantified in terms of economics as well. And so I think that would be quite useful. And one of the things about a debt swap is, in the way in which, the paper is written, it kind of lays out perhaps how even Bangladesh could approach looking at debt swaps and, looking at what the sort of desired needs are of your bilateral lenders, and seeing whether within your budget there are line items which align with that you could, could form candidates for a certain quantum for a debt swap. I needn't go all the way through it, but I've given you the link to the paper so you can sort of work your way through that. I think that would be quite useful as well. But there are a few of the things that I'd like to point to. There are studies out there which suggest that even if you're able somehow to build resilience against climate through mitigation and adaptation, the mere fact that there is an increase in the severity of climate-related natural disasters would suggest that there is a cost of capital, increased cost of capital associated with that. So again, it would be nice within the DSA to be able to see that the increasing cost of debt as a result of the increase of the severities associated with natural disasters. That would have been nice to see in the paper. Maybe that would be a subsequent addition to that work. I'd also like to point out that other than the DSA, there is you may be familiar with the term MTDS, sort of medium-term debt strategy. The medium-term debt strategy, which I read quickly yesterday for Bangladesh, actually also doesn't mention anything to do with climate. And so when you think about the MTDS is really something which focuses specifically on what the mixture of debt, the type of debt, short, medium, longer term debt that you should have within your portfolio. And it looks at analysis of that debt over a sort of 3 to 5 year period. It seems to me this is exactly the kind of analysis that you need to couple with the DSA, within which you're looking at what is the cost and what is the mixture of debt that you need to have, And you could enhance that MTDS with various scenarios, like what you've done, for example, for the DSA, to look at the occurrence of a natural disaster during the 5-year period, to look to see how debt costs would accrete as a result of that. You could also building the CRDCs in terms of that, in terms of any kind of, stay of execution of interest and or principal following an event, if you like, and model that within the MTDS. And it seems to me that that would be where you'd want to do this to work out whether your debt is actually sustainable or not. But again, this is another challenge that I have with a lot of the work done by the IMF and the World Bank, in that they have lots of different methodologies, but quite often they're decoupled and they should be related. So the MTDS and the DSA should somehow be related in general outside of climate risk analysis, but specifically because we're talking about it today, I'm suggesting that it should be there should be a coupling between those two methodologies, and certainly the exercise that you've done would provide an opportune time to be able to explore what that relationship should be. And I think finally what I'd like to conclude with is really just to say that I guess for any government, there's going to be a tension between, whether they spend money on, gross capital formation, for example, in other words, they spend money on growth opportunities, or they spend money because it's politically expedient, depending on where you are in the sort of political cycle. Is there an election next year or the year afterwards? Maybe that will determine whether the government considers it prudent to be able to spend money on what may be considered to be non-political and vote-winning activities versus, spending money on growth. That tension will always exist. And so I think, in a sense, this comes down to governance and understanding how to manage governance better. And there's quite a lot of work that's been done on that. I've done some work on that myself, but others. So I think that focusing on the governance issue is useful as well, in terms of determining what kind of expenditure is good expenditure at which point during the tenure of a government. And I would probably leave it at that.
Okay. Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Howard. So now I would like to request Dr. Sadiq Ahmed, who is the Vice Chairman of PRI here and former World Bank official.
Also
Over to you,
from
Sadiq
Boston
bhai, and
University.
a lot of comments which are very relevant to you. So you'll have to respond to some of those.
Thank you. I'll try to do justice. I think it's a tough call. Anyway, Professor Rahman Subhan, Chairman CPD, Dr. Hamida Khatun, Executive Director, co-panelists, distinguished participants. It is an honor and privilege to participate in this discussion of a very important policy challenge. I'd like to thank my very dear friend and fellow researcher, Dr. Hamida Khatun, for inviting me. I'd like to commend the authors for sharing a very well-researched and thoughtful paper. I very much appreciate and agree with the core focus of the research and the sensible policy conclusion it offers. In my comments, I would offer some suggestions for sharpening the methodology and analysis with a view to strengthening the analytical base of the policy conclusions. I'll also try to address the excellent interventions made by my former boss and teacher, Professor Rahman Subhan. As always, he's very sharp and to the point. There are two elements of standard public debt sustainability analysis that we are all aware, and that is the sustainability of external debt and the sustainability of domestic debt. These are interrelated, but often have different dimensions. Both are very important. And as such, traditional debt sustainability analysis conducted by the World Bank and the IMF, they rightly focus on the sustainability of total debt. In the context of Bangladesh, the sustainability of domestic debt is a much bigger policy challenge than the sustainability of external debt in particular. In particular, the issues of fiscal stability And liquidity concerns are much more closely related to domestic debt as compared with the external debt. The simplest way to illustrate this point is to look at the evolution of debt sustainability issues in Bangladesh. If you look at a long-term trend, total debt to GDP has been falling over time, climbing down from 48% of GDP in fiscal year 2002 to 39% in fiscal year 2025. This is largely due to the external debt that has trimmed down sharply from 34% of GDP to only 15% of GDP now over the same period. On the other hand, domestic debt has climbed from 13% of GDP to 23%. And reflecting this changing composition of total public debt, the interest cost has grown from 1.6% of GDP to 2.2%. But owing to the growing cost of domestic debt, not foreign debt, which has risen from 1.3% of GDP to 1.9%. That's the cost of domestic debt. External debt has remained flat. Interest cost external debt remained flat at 0.3% of GDP, notwithstanding the growing interest cost of external debt because of the changing composition of external borrowing. These are all fact-based numbers as of 2020-25, fiscal year 2025. Now, the particular focus of this paper is on external debt sustainability. But then when you go to pages 55, 61 of the paper that I have read, it switches to sustainability of total public debt, where fiscal sustainability issues are brought in. I think the paper will benefit from making this distinction clear between the sustainability of external debt and the sustainability of total debt, where the dominant component has to do with domestic debt, not external debt. Because the liquidity constraints and fiscal sustainability are much more closer to domestic debt management than to external debt. And I'll illustrate this point. The fact that liquidity constraint is not an external debt issue can be very easily illustrated by looking at the total debt servicing cost of PPG external debt. So when we talk about interest cost and amortization, we have to be careful that we do not confuse PPG debt with private debt and with private debt servicing. So when we have, I've seen many numbers floating around on interest cost and amortization, but when the focus of this paper on public guaranteed debt, and in fiscal year 25, that's the latest number from the world from the Bangladesh Bank website, the total cost stood at $3.4 billion. Of which amortization was 2 billion and interest cost was 1.4 billion. Now, what is it in relation to the total exports? Total export was $81 billion. So it is 4.2% of total export earnings. And even a doubling of the current weighted average interest cost. Sir, you asked me what was the average interest cost. The weighted average interest cost presently is 1.4%. And even if you double it to 2.9% of GDP, 2.9% weighted average, which will take about 20-25 years, because the way the amortization happens, the new debt comes in. The IMF did this exercise, and their simulations show that there is no liquidity constraint, and it is very easily understood. Why? Because 3.4 billion, if it go to 4 billion or 5 billion, if your exports will also grow from 81 billion, 25 billion to 90 billion, there will never be a payments problem for external debt as far as the normal outcomes are. Now, of course, the PPG, external debt has been growing in the 15 months owing to the extraordinary BOP financing and made by the Bangladesh Bank to accumulate reserves and stabilize exchange rate from the IMF, from the World Bank, the ADB, the budget support, etc. So the external debt indicators will weaken. There's no question, the point you raised in 26 and 27. But again, if you look at the long term, there will be a temporary blip. It will again reverse back to fiscal year 28 unless there is a catastrophic development. What could be a catastrophic development? And what could trigger an external payments problem? To answer this question, you have to look at the total external debt, not just PPG. And total external debt, as you know, has been growing. It's now almost 113 billion, not 79 billion. Then you have to include all public, all private, and all non-guaranteed borrowings. And then you have to combine that with a huge export shock. The probability of this event is very low, as Professor Rahman Suman very rightly pointed out, because you really need a dumb government to get into that scenario. So the payments crisis, even then, the payments crisis will only affect the private sector debt, because the private sector debt short term is 10 billion and the other is about 9 billion, 19 billion. They will have a payments problem. Why? Because the foreign exchange availability in the market might be constrained because of the shock of the export earnings. But public debt problem will not be a problem. Why? Even the reserve, there is a $26 billion reserves. For them to fetch $4 billion debt payments every year, no brainer. The problem arises with the public, with the domestic debt. I'll come to that. The second methodological and analytical question concerns how climate change effects are introduced in the debt service analysis, sustainable analysis. This was also a question asked by Professor Rahman Suman. Now, this is a very tough question. I tell you why. When the Dutch policymakers were looking at the Dutch delta investments, they put a value to the loss of life and limb, a very high value, from flooding, to emphasize the high cost, opportunity cost of ignoring the Dutch investments, the delta investments. And it is not surprising that they're the best delta investment in the whole world, this delta management program. So that is the level. I do not think most countries of the world are still geared to that kind of scenario. So at a more pragmatic level, I believe it can be done in two ways. One way would be to argue that unless corrective steps are taken, the cost of climate change would translate into lowering of the average GDP growth path by destroying physical capital-led productivity. This is the way that we model it when we did the Delta plan, and our estimates showed that on average, the cost of climate change could be as high as 1.3% of GDP per year, which is pretty high. And we did a low base case scenario, and we did the sustainability analysis based on that. The other approach, of course, is the way that is done in this paper, which is to argue that the costs will be, result in increase in public spending and public investment, which will raise fiscal deficit and public borrowing. And this is the assumption that is made in this paper. But note that this does not necessarily translate into one-to-one increase in external debt as assumed in this paper, which I think is a weakness. You don't assume that all the total cost of mitigation and even if you don't assume mitigation, even addressing that concern will be result in external debt. No, why? Because as we have seen in the last 15, 20 years, much of the expenditure in the budget is domestic financed through domestic borrowing, not external borrowing. Relief and rehabilitation type spending associated with natural disasters are mostly local cost spending. Foreign spending is mostly imported capital goods. That is World Bank loan or whatever loan, under is a budget support operation or it's a grant funding to supply local cost. But that is, I don't think any sensible country will borrow externally to finance local costs. And that would be a disaster in my view. And I will not recommend Bangladesh to do it at all, unless there's a free grant money. So I don't see this translating into one-to-one into external borrowing. However, even if it does not translate into external borrowing, it will translate into domestic borrowing. Why? Because of the low tax to GDP ratio and because of the low scope for raising taxes, it will automatically go into all the spending, whether it's current spending or capital spending, mostly capital spending, will go into domestic debt. And that will create the debt servicing problem, because right now the total domestic debt servicing burden is as high as 4% of GDP. So you can see that if you raise 6.2% of 6.7% of GDP as taxes, and you have to pay 4% or 5% of GDP as domestic debt servicing, you have very little fiscal space. That is, to me, that is the fundamental constraint. That's also to the IMF the fundamental constraint. That's why they do that revenue sharing. Not for external debt. Why? Because the government, even if the government is broke, they will print money, get the money from the central bank and pay off the external debt. So external debt is not an issue really, honestly. I do not see any risk of default for Bangladesh, even with all the changes that you're talking about. Now, the other argument is that what is happening to the, how do we manage climate change and climate risks? We have a history of from 2009, they have an adaptation policy and all that stuff. And this is now 2025, 15, 16 years of experience. And we have seen that the government's capacity and ability to finance climate adaptation and mitigation expenses is much lower than necessary. We all know that. But it's also true that most of it is funded through domestic resources. Why? Given the global reality, I would strongly argue that developing a climate response strategy based on expected financing from global climate facility or other forms of climate fund is bound to fail. And indeed, that is what has happened. In the hope that we will mobilize foreign funding, we have been neglecting most of the adaptation and mitigation measures. And that is a fundamental flaw in policy making in Bangladesh today. We should continue to fight for our legitimate claim that much of the climate-induced costs are owing to carbon releases from developed countries. There's no problem with that. That argument has been made, continue to make it. But in practice, there's very little hope, given the current environment, that global funding support in a substantial amount will be forthcoming. Why? Let us look at the Green Climate Fund. A lot of noise, a lot of celebrations in 2010. It started with a pledge to mobilize US $100 billion every year by 2020. What has happened? What is the actual outcome? As of 2018, a total of only US $9.3 billion was collected over the first 8 years. A first round replenishment pledge mobilized another 10 billion as a pledge for the period 2025. A second round replenishment generated an additional 10.6 billion pledge for 26-30. So over a 20-year period, a total pledge is $30 billion, which is mere $1.5 billion a year as compared with 100 billion that was dreamt. Importantly, what is the share of Bangladesh from GCF? As far as I know, as of the latest data I have, is 461 million over a 15-year period. That's $30 million per year. It's a pittance. Would I have any strategy to manage my climate strategy on that? No, not at all. Of course, there's another way that we can do it. What is the right approach? While we should continue to fight for greater global financing for climate-induced damages, at the policy level, we must focus on mobilizing more resources, domestic sources. And I've done some research in this area, and I believe there is substantial scope for mobilizing domestic resources to fight climate change through proper pricing of carbon fuel, through adopting a carbon tax, adopting the polluter pays principle, and adopting the beneficiary pays principle. These are fundamental lessons of global, what we call environmental fiscal reforms, which are missing in Bangladesh today. The paper may want to recognize this reality of global climate financing and strengthen its emphasis on the need for domestic financing through environmental fiscal reforms, which is a big missing element in policy making in Bangladesh. I think also importantly, additionally, there is substantial scope to climate sensitize the overall public spending. Why stop at 0.84 as a climate funding? The problem is, we're labeling a few expenditures climate finance, but the whole public expenditure should be sensitized and made adaptable. If we want to adapt a green growth strategy, that should be made adaptable to support that green growth strategy. Then by definition, the entire public investment program, the entire fiscal policy should be geared to supporting that. And that is the main way that you can mainstream climate financing in budget making and policy investment and public investment planning in Bangladesh. Without that, we will not have a climate sensitive policy strategy. Because I think waiting for global funds to provide us money, we will miss the boat. And we'll be again waiting for another 10, 15 years. With that, I'll stop here unless there were other questions that Professor Ramanswan wants, I can answer them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sadiq. Ahmed, for your remarks quite clearly, and you have made some very important recommendations for the improvement of the paper, and also made some recommendations for the government to really integrate the climate issues in the whole fiscal policy measures, and also the public investment situation in the country. So now I would like to request Mr. Inamul Haq, who is the Managing Director and Country Risk Officer at Standard Chartered Bank in Bangladesh.
Thank you. I think is the time pressing, so I'm not going to go further too much deeper. At the same time, the analytical discussion that all the distinguished guests has presented, so it's going to be too complex that I want to make it. So I like to make a very broad comments from the banking perspective. One is in outstanding publications, and thanks for bringing that at a timely fashion. Question remains on a softer side that which government going to implement? Is it going to be an elected government, or is it going to be a national government? At the same time, the depth that being described in these publications, what about the bureaucracy? Do they have the depth of understanding where and how that has to be functionality needs to be addressed? So these are key areas that I thought of I should highlight on that publication perspective. Numerous numbers got discussed here, but the one final number that I like to highlight is about tax to GDP came down to 6.6%, and government's public expenditure is 12.6%, and a number of banks recovery where banks needs to be funded through national exchequer is going to be a significant question marks. 4 nationalized banks is already being supported by the government, and for now these 5 banks mergers requires another $1.8 billion. So where government fiscal capacity going to be constant too. So Dr. Sajid mentioned about more to do with the local funding, which remains a challenge from the government perspective. I understand that international funding going to be mere resources and most talked about issues, but we need to bring this fiscal capacity in terms of funding that. LDC graduation perspective, I'm sure it's going to be going for an extension, but meanwhile, it's already being marketed at 28 to 43%, and everybody has highlighted. So LDC graduation is a matter of mere requirements that we need to look at where and how that could be phased out. But one particular factor that I like to highlight about from the perspective of banks like Standard Chartered Bank, where that can be contributed towards. Globally, we remain committed for debt to climate natural swaps for about $300 billion that we have recently done in Bahamas. And that can create a significant space for countries like us where we can give an inroad in terms of more liquidity space. Secondly, I'd like to highlight about the country platforms such as Just Energy Transition Platform, obsessed in another markets like Indonesia, South Africa, Vietnam, are a key scale of blended finance. Standard Chartered is signatory to the Vietnam and ID just so-called committed on and support these large scale national programs. Bangladesh has established similar approach through Bangladesh Country Development Program. This platform, which is being operationalized, can involve all relevant parties, including private sector, MDBs, development partners, relevant government ministries, to co-create an environment and enabler where Standard Chartered Bank and other multinational banks can bring synergies in terms of funding. Carbon market result-based payment solution and also an automated perspective. We talked about a lot of projects, but we don't know how that synergy can be brought through. So a practical approach in terms of review of some of those on the running shows and on the running projects, how that can be implemented, and also areas as to focus on. So finally, I like to highlight about this particular publications, one particular comment that resilience and adaptations goes hand in hand. And how we quantify that and bring a numerical analysis, probably that's an approach that publications can CPD think about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Inamul Haq, for those precise points. And now I would like to request Mr. Said Yusuf Sadat, economist UNDP, who has been also one of the authors of this book, for Rishi will just wrap up. So Yes. Just your brief comments. Yeah, okay. Okay.
Thank you, ma'am, for this opportunity, and thank you, CPD, for inviting me. And also thanks to the panelists who are here on this early morning in a weekend from across the world. Thank you for joining us. And also excellent presentation by Afrin, who did a great job in presenting all our complex findings. And also thanks to all the panelists who have made lots of important suggestions. This paper was done over a long period of time, and our goal was to demonstrate what happens when we use the LIG DSF for Bangladesh and how climate change can have an impact on that. Of course, there are limitations like any other paper, but in the interest of time, I'll not get into all of that. And as has already been discussed, Bangladesh is now at the forefront of climate change, and despite not contributing much to greenhouse emissions, Bangladesh is really one of the most vulnerable countries in the world. And in our report, this is exactly what we have tried to look into, how climate change and vulnerability can affect external debt sustainability in the case of Bangladesh. And so, as you have seen, that what has been a major, theme of this discussion is that climate change is no longer being considered as an environmental challenge. Rather, it has now transformed into a macroeconomic challenge, given the macro criticality of climate change shocks that we have, modeled and shown in our paper. And these shocks have forced Bangladesh to borrow externally for recovery and adaptation, pushing its debt stock and exposing it to new risks. And our analysis shows that climate-induced losses, if unmitigated, could raise the debt to GDP ratio and potentially push it beyond the thresholds defined by IMF's LIG DSF. And so basically what is happening now is that climate vulnerability is reinforcing debt vulnerability, and they are reinforcing each other so that countries like Bangladesh, which are developing countries and also very climate vulnerable countries, they are now stuck in a vicious cycle of climate change risk and also debt sustainability risk, and that is threatening their development and stability. And with our stress tests, what we have tried to show is that the current global financial architecture itself is partly responsible for this problem, and the fact that climate finance is usually dominated by loans is actually deepening the debt crisis of many climate vulnerable countries. So countries, when they borrow to rebuild what was destroyed by climate disasters, are actually in effect paying twice, once for the loss and damage from climate change, and again to borrow and to repair the loss of damage from climate change. So this is neither sustainable nor just, and that is the point that we have tried to make in our paper. And so the message is that the world must now move more towards concessional finance, but what we have already heard from the panelists is that we are moving in the opposite direction, which is a cause for alarm for countries like Bangladesh. But of course, that doesn't mean, like Kevin already mentioned, that doesn't mean that we will disengage from multilateral development banks. We will actually engage with them further so that we can reform these issues in our favor. In the context of Bangladesh, of course, I'll just end in 1 minute. Yeah. So in the context of Bangladesh, the fiscal reforms are also necessary. We cannot only think about depending on external resources, like the speakers have already mentioned. Domestic resource mobilization is also important. And so at the end of the day, unless we can come up with our own resources, we will be in a crisis, and we cannot actually depend on external loans all the time. So with that, I'll just end here. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry for hurrying you up, because chairman will have to leave. But we have another speaker, Rishi. I'll just take another 1 minute from you, because we'll launch this report. We'll do a photo session before I come to you. So. Okay. Okay, if you stay. Okay. Rishi, now we would like to request Dr. Rishikesh Ram Bhandari, Assistant Director, Global Economic Governance Initiative, Boston University Global Development Policy Center, for his remarks. So you are the last speaker in the panel. I'm sorry to keep you wait for so long, but you have been one of the coordinators. He's the coordinator, and he has been the person who had been supporting us in conducting this study, and also currently another study which is going on. So over to you, Rishi.
A lot has already been said, and so congratulations. I've really had the chance to follow this right from the concept note stage to the publication date today. So congratulations to the team. I'll just say three things very, very briefly. Something that has not been remarked is the importance of looking at both the physical climate risks as well as the transition risks together, because climate shocks don't happen in isolation. And so I think that's where this paper has, at least begun a dialogue in terms of thinking about both the transition side and the physical side in one particular context. And I'll also echo what some of the speakers earlier have said about the need for the entire fiscal framework to really mainstream climate change, and not just the 5% allocations that are often made in regards to supporting climate finance. And then finally, I'll just conclude by saying that a lot of this really hinges on the quality of data that's available in terms of being able to do the analysis that we really need in terms of the various types of climate shocks that we can actually integrate. And so how can we continue to build the data sets that can really capture the level of granularity to get results at the confidence levels that we really want. So that's going to be, I think, an important consideration. But yeah, I'll just conclude by saying that we look forward, the task force looks forward to continuing to partner with CPD for the next 2 years. We just had a public event a couple of days ago here at Annuals. But thank you for your leadership on these issues, and I'll pass the floor back to you, Clementa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rishi, for your support and collaboration. With this, we would end the session, but before ending, as I said, we'll do a photo session. I'm sorry that you can't join here, but you'll be on the screen. I think our photographer will try to capture you also on the screen while we hold the report. So thank you. Okay, thank you very much. I wish you have a productive day. Today is, of course, weekend for you, for us also, but we are really grateful that you have spared your time during a week, and stay well.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.